Almost
That
out of
sounds
time.
great. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I must say that I was a bit scared to come have a talk about open contribution policies in a track that's really called like the law track, I think, because I am not a lawyer, as those of you that know me know. And also because this presentation is really more planned for a more general public than one of legal experts. So please bear with me. I'm going to try to cut it as short as possible to see if we can do maybe like some questions in the chat or something like that towards the end. So let's see if this works. Yes. So I usually start this talk by in the old times and the before times by asking the public if they knew whether the employee had an open source policy or not. And generally, I would get a wide variety of responses, but we actually fortunately have some data around this today. That data is not particularly new, but essentially, it tells us something that roughly in 2018 at least, close to half of companies didn't have a policy, and a few, 13%, didn't actually know whether they had one or not. Of course, that it's what's interesting about the data from this Linux Foundation to do a new stack survey is this is widely different if you ask small companies or bigger ones, right? Large companies tend to have a lot more structure around this stuff. This is, of course, a very biased sample. So if you go outside of our tech circle, the data is probably very different. That said, what's an interesting question is, what actually does it mean not to have a policy? And popular belief around this is you can essentially do whatever it is that you want. In fact, when you don't have a policy, what you generally have is an unwritten one, right? It just means that you don't have a written policy. And so that unwritten policy can be anything from anything goes to there is no open source at all. And so that brings us to the question of, well, are you in the right camp if you have a policy, and in the wrong camp if you don't? And it turns out that you can totally have a policy, and that policy can be hugely restrictive, bureaucratic, full of red tape, very opaque, and that really doesn't make it a policy that empowers engineers. So essentially, we can sort of graph how open source contribution policies stand on sort of like a full quadrant graph, where you have implicit to explicit on the vertical axis and restrictive to permissive on the horizontal one. And so let's start placing organizations in there, because that's kind of an interesting exercise to do. Small organizations, as we've seen, tend to have an unwritten policies, and they tend to be on the permissive side, because fairly often the IP of code doesn't matter to these organizations that much. Of course, that's different if they're actually software vendors. Startups are usually even more implicitness than SMEs. And they're usually more restrictive, either because they are actually focused on IP, or because they just want to have their engineers really focused on product, and so they don't do a lot of open source anyway. The non-tech enterprise tends to be a lot more restrictive, usually doesn't know about open source that much, and so isn't really explicit about open source because it's not something that it really has to deal with. If you move to old tech companies, they used to be really restrictive and extremely explicit about being very restrictive. Of course, like the maximum that you will get are patent trolls, which are going to be super restrictive, and of course, super explicit about being super restrictive. And if you move to the first quadrant in the explicit permissive area, you will find most large tech companies, and most tech companies today are in that area. And of course, the trendsetters tend to be in the highly permissive and explicit angle. So what's interesting is to see how we move, how organizations move, and how the quality and the permissiveness and explicitness of policies change as organizations mature and grow, and essentially grow up. So startups will tend to move to a more permissive role as they grow, right? You start to have engineers that come in to do infrastructure, and when you do infrastructure, even if there were IP considerations, you sort of like start like really being part of the open source community, and as a result, you become more permissive. And then usually something happens, and there is the first sort of IP council that comes in, and unless they are very, very savvy about open source, the end result tends to be sort of like a lockdown on those policies. And so you will see as they grow, these companies sort of like moving into being more restrictive as they become explicit. Of course, the ideal situation would be for them to, yes, become more explicit about those, but what they can and cannot do, but stay on the permissive end. If we look at old tech companies, we've seen a lot. I mean, this is now sort of commonplace, but a lot of organizations, old tech companies, Microsoft is the canonical example of this, but there are others, have really done this transition from restrictive to permissive, keeping sort of like the same explicitness. Last but not least, as we see more and more of digital transformation coming along, we see these non-tech enterprise moving into being more explicit, unfortunately, not being less restrictive as a result. And again, here, what we'd like to see is sort of have them move from implicit restrictive to explicit permissive. All right. As you can imagine, like the best place to be from an open source perspective is in this top right quadrant, where you're both clear about your expectations, but also really allow your engineers to be involved in the broad community. Okay, so what is a good policy? Well, you can't really answer that question that clearly. There's essentially sort of like three large perspectives about it: the engineering perspective, the legal perspective, and the business perspective. And a good policy is one that combines these three perspectives in a way that is conducive to happy engineers and good business. And so we'll try to figure out how to do that. So from an engineering perspective, a good policy is generally permissive. You want to allow open source contributions to be part of like how you do engineering, part of your culture. And that's based on trust and autonomy. It has to be explicit because you want things to be clear and well documented so engineers don't lose a lot of time on this stuff. You want to have the policy be informative, so explain why you cannot use a particular piece of open source software or contribute to this particular open source software, because that helps educate engineers and helps them make, again, gain autonomy and make decisions upfront without having to go to legal to wonder whether they'll be able to use that software or contribute to this other project. And lastly, you want it to be as frictionless as possible because that just is better. So from a legal perspective, what are you trying to do? Again, I'm not a lawyer, so there's probably things that savvy lawyers would argue about here, and happy to discuss that in the comments. Essentially, part of the role of a lawyer in an organization is to minimize the risk. Right. So you want to avoid giving away competitive advantage. You want to avoid giving IP that can be used defensively, for example. You want to avoid accidental reputational damages by opening up code that shouldn't be, or by showing up like how actually not that good your engineers are in your organization, or lots of different reasons of that nature. What else do you want? Well, you want the policy to be actually followed across the whole organization. Like the worst outcome is if you have a part of engineering that are just not following it. Lawyers also want to be savvy about written information because there is some information that is, for legal reasons, better when it is written, for example, compliance, and some that it is better when it is not. For example, when you're infringing patents, it's better not to be able to, that the other party can't really prove that you were doing that on purpose or that you knew what you were doing when you did. And so I think sort of like the critical issue that legal tends to face when the policies aren't well designed is there's so much stuff that is menial that it's really hard to actually identify when you really have issues that should have their attention. And lastly, from a business perspective, what are you looking for? Well, you're looking for engineering to be happy and productive. You want also, obviously, your risk minimized, and you want good communication between legal and engineering, so you don't have to be in the middle of that all the time. And you want the policy to be aligned with business goals, and that is absolutely critical. So we have this tension here, right? On one end, we have a legal that wants to minimize risk and engineering that wants to maximize velocity. We have a culture in legal that tends to be oral, whereas engineering prefer sort of like async communication. Legal tends to be on a manager's schedule, engineering on a maker's schedule. Legal is all about the gray area, and engineering tends to be really sort of like everything is ones or zeros. And in an organization, the role of engineering is to be innovative, and the role of legal is to be conservative. So how do you come to agreement? Well, first of all, you acknowledge this tension, right? This is checks and balances. This is how it should work. Like, this tension is normal. And then you want to listen to both sides. You want to remind them that on both sides, both legal and engineering, that their goal is to help achieve common business goals, right? And so, sure, legal's role is to minimize risk, but like that cannot be at the expense of innovation. And on the other hand, engineering needs cannot be fulfilled at the expenses of the company's survival, right? If you actually absolutely want to open source everything, but from a business perspective, you really need to have that IP, some of your IP protected. Well, that's not going to work either. So a good policy will find common ground. Again, it's going to be really aligned with your business goals. And the other thing that you really have to keep in mind is a good policy will change as your business does. So let's dig into what a policy really is about. Generally, in a policy, you will have an open source policy will deal with using open source and also with contributing to open source. Using open source is actually a fairly well understood problem today. It's a compliance problem, essentially. Sort of like the really important thing here that is sometimes missed is to make sure that the software that the licenses that you're relying on are compatible not only with your business model today, but also with your future business model. If you're if you're a SaaS-based organization and suddenly want to do on-premise, well, depending on like what licenses you have in your stack, you might have a few things to figure out. A really good tip here is to really help your engineers deal with missing licenses. Missing licenses is still a problem on lots of software today, and avoiding to lose a lot of time and back and forth on that is really useful. So the thing that's more difficult is really about contributing to open source. And there are sort of like two sides to that. One is contributing outside of work, and the other one is contributing at work as part of your job. So the contributing outside of work part, so here's some interesting data about this. If you actually ask engineers whether they can contribute to open source on their free time, you're going to get a whole lot of different answers. Some will say yes, absolutely, without asking for permission. Others will say yes, but I do have to ask for permission, which actually means that sometimes you get no as an answer. Some will just say, well, I can't. I mean, that's common even in large organizations. Lastly, some will just actually don't know whether they can contribute to open source or not. There was a 2017 GitHub survey on this topic. What is interesting here, sorry about that, is that, well, a good half at that time actually knew that they could contribute to open source on their own time. Scary 37% had absolutely no idea whether they could or not, right? And that's fairly concerning when you think about these people actually contributing to open source code where maybe they actually weren't supposed to do that. So why is there so much confusion? One of the good reasons that there was so much confusion is, well, one of the main reasons is that this depends on the jurisdiction, and that in particular in the US, and in particular in California, if you build software on equipment that is owned by your employer, regardless of whether you're doing it as part of your job or not, it is actually it becomes the property of your employer. And so that is fairly surprising to engineers in general, and leads to a whole bunch of issues. And they really, frankly, suggest that folks shouldn't be doing this and should have policies that are more aligned with expectations. One of the really good solution here, in my opinion, is the Balanced Employee IP Agreement that was started by GitHub. It's based on their own IP agreement, and essentially it really scopes the area where the employer is going to keep ownership of the IP to what is tied to the company's business, and that is really created for or relating to that business. So if you focus on the contribution at work part, there are here again sort of like two really different areas. One is releasing and one is patching. So are you releasing software that the organization has built, or are you sort of fixing software that you're relying on and that is maybe under the purview or control of someone else? There is actually quite, more clarity as to what to do for releasing open source software. And in general, like, organizations know how to do that reasonably well. Sort of like things that you can do here that are interesting is to, again, in the wisdom, the idea of making the process as seamless as possible, making distinction between publishing a really large open source project that has to go through a bunch of reviews, and that makes sense, and then releasing like way smaller stuff. For example, like a tiny module if you're like a JS developer. And there's like an interesting rule here. I don't know if it still applies, but Google had in the past if it's less than 100 lines of code, you can just ship it. You don't have to ask for permission. Whatever you do, you want well-oiled and well-documented processes, checklists, tooling, et cetera, et cetera. The Tobie group has a bunch of really useful resources here. And it's great if the OSPO can really offer help here. And lastly, like an important tip, in my opinion, is to make sure that you promote working in the open when you know that an open source project is going to be released, rather than working in a closed way and then dumping everything in the open, like kind of, was a big boom for release or something. That creates a bunch of extra work, and frankly, isn't really conducive to building communities around your projects. So last but not least, patching. This is sort of the poor parent of these policies in general, which is kind of a shame because it often is the most common activity and one of the most important ones that developers do as they build stuff, right? You build something, you're relying on a lot of different open source projects to do that. You bump into an issue, you fix that issue locally so that you can continue working, and then you want to upstream this. And this upstreaming process is really sort of like how the whole open source ecosystem builds and shares collective value. And so it's really important to make that as easy as possible. And so really what you want to do here is make that frictionless. And trust as much as possible your engineers to do the right thing here. So, if you have, let's say, a set of conditions in which you approve upstreaming or contributing to open source projects, set those up, right? And then as you make decisions about special cases or things that you weren't aware of, start caching those decisions. Build essentially approve and deny lists, so you know upfront. So engineers know upfront, well, this is going to be easy because let's say it's an MIT license and it's on GitHub and I can just contribute. And this I'm not allowed to because it's AGPL, for example, and like my company doesn't want me to be contributing to AGPL code. That's just an example, of course. And so, right, so, taking a step back, we have 5 minutes left. Really, what you have, like a good policy will have compliance for how to use open source, and then a whole set of processes for how to contribute to open source, dividing it up between at work and outside of work cases, and then in particular the at work case into how do you release software that you've built as an organization, and how do you enable sort of like your engineers to be part of the broad open source ecosystem by making essentially patching or working on existing open source projects as seamless as possible. Lastly, and I think this is really important and part of the thing that is unfortunately not done enough, is you can really turn your policy into an app like services. You can automatically approve requests that meet pre-established requirements. For example, as I mentioned before, patch an MIT licensed open source project on GitHub. You can automatically reject requests that don't meet your criteria. And at that point, like allow the engineers to actually reach out and say, well, this is a special case. It's really important for that reason, this reason, blah, blah, blah. And like that, you can really manually handle the requests that are neither directly approved nor directly rejected. And you can, again, as I was saying, you can cache those decisions and they become part of your app as your services as you build sort of like that database of decisions. Adobe actually implemented such a system like a while back, and it shortened its review time from 4.6 days to 4.6 hours. So before that, contributing was required a week, and suddenly it was half a day. And from a really just an engineering perspective and a day-to-day work, that makes a massive difference. And what's really interesting was an approach.
Tobie, we're at just about 1 or 2 more minutes here.
Wonderful. I'm done. It's perfect. And yeah, the last 2 things that so the real benefit of moving that into an app or a set of services is that you can start collecting data and understand what you're doing, like understand your open source activity. You can then start promoting it. You can connect engineers that are working on different projects and that don't know about it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all I have. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to take questions in the chat and writing as we're close to over time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Tobie.